What's up everyone, my name is Splice Knight and welcome back to Reflections. So today we're going to be talking about not something normal, we're talking about a theory. And that theory is the idea Rey, Finn, and the emo child that is Kylo Ren / Ben Solo are actually not what everybody seems to think they are. Let's talk about it. So this particular theory actually stems from something that I feel like I've noticed in the last couple of films. As you might have noticed, we've actually shifted who's had the quintessential Luke saber. At first, it was with Finn, who was a clone trooper. Now, the interesting thing about that is that he had very minimal development with it, and then it eventually went to what is now considered the main character of that series, Rey. Then, of course, you have someone who's had way more experience with a lightsaber, who's had much fuller training, and who's been trained by a couple of different people. And that is Kylo Ren. Now, right now, as of the latest movie, which would have been The Last Jedi as of the time of recording this, and or the time of its release, so if you see this like a year or two down the road, and the new movie has come out, then you may be getting different information. At which point, this myth is probably already busted. But, getting on to what I think is actually going to happen, it actually involves the animated series that has been kind of evolving over the last two series. So, first of all, you have the Clone Wars, and then you have Star Wars Rebels. And so the important thing about these two particular shows is that they have one real consistent theme, and Ahsoka. Those are the two things that they have in common. Ahsoka Tano was introduced, and there was one other thing that was introduced in Clone Wars specifically that carried on to Rebels animated show. And that was this idea of there being gods of the Force. That is to say, a manifestation of the extreme dark side, a manifestation of the extreme light side, and a manifestation of the middle ground, the gray, if you will. A lot of the time in the Legends, for example, this was most notably mentioned as Grey Jedi, who are basically people who didn't want the problem of being limited to only the light side, or only the dark side, or whatever the case may be. But they ended up using both sides of the Force intermittently as a form of balance. And I feel like that was one of the things that the original Star Wars really lacked. It had this idea of very extreme ideological good and evil. There was a very clear Sith are the bad guys and Jedi are the good guys, or I guess in the case of that it was the Resistance and the Empire were the good and bad guys, respectively. The whole framework was very black and white. Divisions were clear. Now, of course, in the prequels that everybody has so many issues with, there was this clear notion that the good, the Jedi, were not nearly as immaculate, godlike as so many people tended to portray them, at least in the original series that was New Hope, Empire, and Return of the Jedi, which was not like the idealized version of the Sith and Jedi that we see consistently in both the original trilogy and the sort of future trilogy, if you will, or the sequel trilogy, as it's kind of been dubbed. And in those two particular elements, we see this idealization of the Jedi and the Sith as the epitome of great evil and great good. And this was something that the prequels kind of played with, which was one of the issues that some people had, but it was primarily story-driven. A lot of people had issues with the prequels, but that's not really important. The main interesting element is that starting in that point, we got a more clear definition through the Clone Wars animated series, and not the one that ended up essentially getting retconned out of canon, which that's a whole nother discussion for another day. But the interesting thing specifically is the manifestation of good, evil, and middle. And what I think this all ends up getting around to is that we've seen them pop up in two animated shows that are specifically defined as canon to Disney's version of Star Wars, which the now sequel trilogy is a part of. So, understanding that, we kind of get this idea that maybe they're going to feed that kind of ideological framework or those kinds of ideas into the trilogy. And what we've seen right now is where Finn was never really on one side or the other of the Force. He had minor use of it in the first film, and then almost none in the second, but he was doing a lot of other stuff in the second film. Now, the interesting thing is that in the second film, The Last Jedi, we have a clear demonstration of Rey and Kylo both kind of going from their sort of shaky ideological frameworks of kind of good and kind of evil, and coming to a much more middle ground idea, which was a lot of people's thoughts where that was going, was they were going to come to more of a middle, and that was the idea that maybe we'd achieve some sort of balance. But in a kind of interesting twist, what The Last Jedi actually does is it takes this kind of coming to the middle as a way to create a dramatic fissure between the two characters. Kylo ends up seeing that not everyone is going to be accepting of the idea of letting the past die, moving on, letting a new era sort of take the life that was there and remake it into their own unique element.
Let the past die. Kill it if you have to.
And seeing that, he decides to, in his past, his whole metric and idea of dealing with stress like this is to lash out. And the side of the dark side of the Force is much more specifically suited to this idea of lashing out and emotional attachment and feelings of anger and frustration. This has been something that's been cohesively layered through all the different trilogies, and it's no different here. So what they ended up doing was bringing Kylo and Rey from being very middle to Kylo going way to the dark side of the Force. And when Rey realizes that Kylo will not conform to the old idealized adages and mind frame that you have of the Jedi, she believes that he is unsavable, that there is nothing that she can do to truly bring him into the light, which is her idea of the ideal. Now, that being said, what we witness is her reaction to that is to swing dramatically further to the light side of the Force. And these two dramatically separate entities that they've now become as a result of their trying to meet in the middle and then dramatic fission, essentially, is that we've experienced what it is to be all different elements of the Force. We've experienced dark side, light side, gray, and then dramatic dark and dramatic light. Now, what I think will be interesting is if the third film essentially expands on this idea and decides to essentially create a new version of the Gods of the Force, which is to say, I think that Kylo has gone so far to the dark side at this point that he will essentially end up succumbing to the almost godlike powers that the Force itself gives you. And whether or not that means he ends up becoming a god of the Force, who knows? But that is my theory right now. I think that Kylo will become the dark god of the Force, the brother, which is also significant. The genders specifically of the two characters are consistent with the sides of the Force. The sister was the epitome, the goddess of the light side of the Force, the pure positive energy of the Force. And like that, Rey is also the female character who is a clear, elemental, strong definition of the light side of the Force. And we have it shown very dramatically that they are incredibly powerful Force users. In fact, it was even quoted by Luke saying specifically, "I've never seen power quite like this. I never knew what to do then, but I do now." And that is actually something that ended up pushing Rey to the more middle end. Now, that said, they are both incredibly powerful Force users. This has been overstated a number of times. And consistent with that, the god and goddess of the dark and light side of the Force respectively, which again, those genders do match up. Kylo is the same gender as the brother, who was the male god of the dark side of the Force, and the sister, the female god of the light side of the Force, like Rey. Now, those are two very powerful Force users that are currently in the known meta. Now, the real question is, where's the middle? This is the father. This is the neutral figure of the Force, the one who's able to use both sides of the Force, but in some aspects is almost weaker. It's interesting because if you take a full element of the dark or a full element of the light, you get a lot of positives and negatives depending on what side you go to. But if you use the middle, there's good things and bad things about that as well, obviously, being that you're using both sides of the Force, so you have some of the good and some of the bad from both ends, but you also have some of the drawbacks of both. Although trying to go in the middle is essentially trying to mitigate that. There's still one person that I have not come back to as far as who's actually been using, first of all, the Force, and of course, Luke Skywalker's lightsaber. And that is, of course, Finn, the clone trooper, the guy who was brainwashed at birth to essentially go and be a part of what is essentially the new Empire, the First Order. Now, he's had a plethora of experience being what is essentially a janitor on the dark side. He's had the time to really understand and get familiar with the way that the dark side and the darker elements of that universe work. But he's also had experience on the good side after he defected from the First Order, aka the New Empire, and he actually changed his moral alignment. He was still afraid of defying the First Order, knowing exactly full well what they're capable of. However, he understood that the Resistance was a bet for a more morally justified side of the war. Now, that said, one of the things that was hinted at in The Last Jedi that was very specific to Finn and did kind of receive a lot of critical backlash for was the scene where him and his girlfriend, who dies at the end, they had to deal with something where they were confronted with the fact that neither the First Order nor the Resistance were really, truly good or bad. Now, you have good people on one side, you have bad people on the other side, but you also have the inverse on both sides. Now, what their particular side adventure actually demonstrated and showed Finn was that there are a number of people who ride the line, just like he's kind of been going flip from one side to the other. Now, what I think they're trying to go for is someone who's decided that the Resistance and the First Order are bad, and that there has to be a middle path, a third way, a difference that they can take that isn't necessarily to the light side or full to the dark side of the Force. In that way, he would be the ideal candidate for being the father, essentially the candidate for the most unique and dynamic user of the Force. But he's also, interestingly enough, the one who's been on both sides on so many different conflicts, as I already mentioned, but specifically, he's had some experience with the Force without necessarily being so strongly pulled in one direction or the other. He's been very much middle ground, doing what he has to survive, good or bad. And this has been demonstrated where he ended up having to kill someone who clearly knew him in the past, and dealing with Phasma. These are two shadows of his old life that are coming back to haunt him. Now, those are essentially manifestations of the darker elements, but there are definitely elements from the last film, The Last Jedi, that kind of made him very disillusioned with the idea of the Resistance. There were things that were very dire, and there were things that were done that were, in a lot of people's mindsets, might be a little bit extreme as a countermeasure. I mean, hell, they literally light speed shot a cruiser through another cruiser, which I feel like is almost a little bit jumping the shark. But it does demonstrate that Finn is very middle of the road. And I think that this is definitely where they're going. If they go this way with the third film, I would not be surprised at all. And I really hope that they end up tying this together in some fashion in the end. Because really, we have two incredibly powerful Force users on both ends of the Force spectrum, if you will. And we have a very clear middle ground who's not necessarily as strong as either of them, but is able to recognize the plus and minuses of both sides. And I think, actually, in going further with the Empire and the I guess, New Republic / Resistance, you'd have the added benefit of someone who's experienced both sides and is able to bring harmony to both extremes. And this might even be the case with Kylo and Rey, because you have someone who's very obviously experiencing both sides. So, with that, he might be able to talk to both of them. He might be able to bring them together and truly, for once, again, bring balance to the Force. And I think that is how the 9th episode is going to end. They will finally bring balance to the Force. And whether or not that means leaving these two powerful embodiments of the Force on the dark and the light side of the Force and Finn in the middle, or whether or not it means everybody becomes sort of more of a gray element of the reality. Because, as I said before, it's black, white, and gray. And I think that'll be an interesting way for them to go. It'll be definitely them breaking from the typical Star Wars formula, and it'll also be keeping with the old in the sense that there is still a very clear attitude for these two elements of the Force. And who knows, it might even mirror some of the older stuff that they've referred to as far as the origin of some of the different elements of the Force and how the Jedi and or the Sith came to be. Because it does seem like they're sort of delving into the lore of that a little bit. They did that when they came to this ancient Jedi temple in a place where Luke was impossible to find for the most part. So who really knows what's going on? Anyway, guys, if you like this video, let me know. Let me know what you guys think, too. I want to know if you guys think I'm right, I'm wrong, I'm crazy. If you've got a completely different theory for where it's going to go, always let me know what your thoughts are in those comments down below. And I look forward to hearing from you guys in the future. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button, the little notification bell so you get any sort of notification. Who knows, YouTube's crazy, right? And of course, hit that like button so that they know that you like this content and more people can hear about it. Also, don't forget to share on Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, wherever you like to share videos and let people know about cool shit and cool theories about the future of the Force. Do that. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. My name's Splice Knight, and I'll check you guys out next time. Peace.